Picture this. You are standing in the heart of Paris on a crisp spring morning. The city stretches around you in every direction. A magnificent canvas of pale stone buildings, wide, elegant boulevards, and centuries of human achievement layered one on top of the other like pages in the world's greatest history book. The Seine winds its quiet silver path through the city. Church towers and rooftops catch the early light. The air smells of bread and coffee, and something ancient, something irreplaceable. This is one of the most beautiful cities ever built by human hands. And then you look up. There it is, rising above everything else. A colossal latticework of iron, soaring 300 meters into the sky, its four massive legs planted in the Champ de Mars like the feet of some enormous beast from another world. It is so tall that it dwarfs every building around it, so bold and angular and modern that it seems to belong to a different century entirely. Or perhaps to no century at all, but to some permanent, timeless category of human ambition. You have seen it in photographs 10,000 times. You have seen it on postcards, in films, on the covers of magazines. You know exactly what it is, and yet nothing prepares you for the reality of it. This is the Eiffel Tower. Today, it is the most recognized structure in the entire world. More people visit it each year than any other paid monument on the planet. It has appeared in more films, more photographs, more paintings, more dreams than perhaps any other object ever created by a human being. When people close their eyes and try to picture Paris, that city of cities, that dream at the center of European culture, this is what they see, this iron tower, this impossible, audacious, magnificent thing. But here is what they do not tell you on the tourist brochures. Here is what the postcards leave out, what the Instagram filters erase, what the gentle mythology of Paris tends to quietly forget. When this tower was built, the people of Paris despised it. When it first rose above their rooftops, they were horrified. When the plans were announced, the greatest artists and writers and intellectuals in France signed their names to a furious public protest, demanding that it never be built. They called it a monstrosity. They called it an insult to everything beautiful. They called it, in words that have echoed through history ever since, a gigantic black smokestack, a stain on the face of Paris, a blot on the dignity of France. The very structure that would eventually become the ultimate symbol of elegance, of romance, of Parisian grace, was once the most hated building in the world, and the story of how it went from despised to iconic, from condemned to immortal, is one of the most remarkable stories in the history of human civilization. It is a story about vision, about stubbornness, about the way greatness is almost never recognized in its own time. And it is a story that begins not with iron and rivets and engineering blueprints, but with a city at the height of its glory, and a nation desperate to prove to the world that it was still great. To understand what the Eiffel Tower meant, and why it was so controversial, you have to understand what Paris was in the 1880s. Not the Paris of today, with its glass pyramids and modern art museums and sprawling suburbs. The Paris of the 19th century, a city that had spent 200 years becoming the undisputed cultural capital of the Western world. A city that genuinely believed, with considerable justification, that it was the most beautiful place on earth. Paris in the 1800s was a city of stone. Every building was made of the same pale limestone quarried from the hills around the city, giving the entire metropolis a kind of luminous coherence, a sense that everything belonged together, that the city was not a collection of separate structures, but a single, unified organism. The streets were wide and straight, the result of the massive reconstruction ordered by Napoleon III and carried out by his legendary urban planner, Baron Haussmann, who had torn down entire medieval neighborhoods in the 1850s and 1860s to create the Paris we mostly still see today. Wide boulevards lined with matching 7-story apartment buildings, grand public parks, long sweeping vistas from one end of the city to the other, order, symmetry, classical beauty. The skyline of Paris was low and horizontal. Apart from a handful of church towers and the dome of the Pantheon, nothing rose very high. This was not an accident. The Parisians were fiercely protective of their skyline, their views, their sense of proportion. The city's beauty was inseparable from its human scale. The way the buildings related to the streets below them, the way the rooftops created a gentle, undulating horizon against the sky. To build something tall, dramatically, aggressively tall, was not just an architectural choice. It was an act of violence against everything Paris stood for. And yet, France in the 1880s was a country with something to prove. The previous decade had been catastrophic. In 1870, France had fought a devastating war against Prussia, modern-day Germany, and had been humiliated. The Prussian army had marched on Paris. The city had been besieged for months. People had starved. The government had collapsed. The emperor had surrendered. And in one of the most symbolic acts of humiliation in modern history, the new German Empire had been formally proclaimed, not in Berlin, but in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, the very heart of French royal power, while French citizens watched in helpless fury from the gates outside. France had rebuilt itself over the following decade and a half. A new republic had been established. The economy had recovered, but the wound was still raw, the national pride still bruised. And so, when the French government began planning the 1889 World's Fair, the Exposition Universelle, there was an enormous amount riding on it. This was not just a trade fair or a tourist attraction. It was a statement, a declaration to the entire watching world that France was back, that France was modern, that France was still, in every sense that mattered, the greatest nation on earth. The year 1889 had a special significance. It was the 100th anniversary of the French Revolution, the event that had, in the French national imagination, changed the course of human history. The revolution had given the world the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. It had ended the age of kings and ushered in the age of democracy. And France wanted to celebrate that legacy with something extraordinary, something that had never been done before, something that would make the whole world look at Paris and understand that this city, this nation, this civilization was not finished. It was only beginning. What they needed was a centerpiece, something so spectacular, so unprecedented, so breathtaking that visitors from every corner of the globe would travel to see it. Something that would define the fair the way the Crystal Palace had defined the London exhibition of 1851. They put out a competition. They invited proposals from architects and engineers across France. And among the hundreds of submissions that came in, one stood apart from all the others. So different, so radical, so completely unlike anything that had ever been proposed before, that it seemed less like a building and more like a declaration of war. His name was Alexandre Gustave Eiffel. And if you are imagining a dreamy, impractical visionary, a romantic idealist with his head in the clouds, you are imagining exactly the wrong person. Gustave Eiffel was a pragmatist, an engineer, a man who thought in terms of forces and loads and stress calculations, who saw beauty not as decoration, but as the natural byproduct of perfect structural efficiency. He was, by the time the World's Fair competition was announced, one of the most respected engineers in France, and quietly, one of the most brilliant engineers in the world. He had been born in 1832 in Dijon, in the heart of Burgundy. His father had served as an administrator in the French army. His mother ran a successful fuel distribution business. He had been a mediocre student as a boy, more interested in talking than studying, more gifted at conversation than calculation. But somewhere along the way, something clicked. He discovered engineering. He discovered the poetry of structures, the way iron and steel could be shaped and connected to bear enormous loads, to span great distances, to do things that stone and wood simply could not do. He enrolled at the École Centrale des Arts et Manufactures in Paris, one of the great engineering schools of France, and graduated with distinction in 1855. What followed was a career that reads like a catalogue of audacity. Eiffel made his name building bridges, iron railway bridges across the rivers and gorges of France and beyond. His great gift was an intuitive understanding of how metal structures behaved under stress, how the wind pushed against them, how their own weight tried to pull them apart. He understood that the most efficient structure was not the one that used the most material, but the one that used material in precisely the right places, that a hollow tube was stronger than a solid bar of the same weight, that a lattice of thin iron bars could carry loads that a single thick beam could not. His masterpiece before the tower was the Garabit Viaduct, a railway bridge across a deep gorge in the massive Central, completed in 1884. It was the highest bridge in the world at the time, a breathtaking arch of iron that rose 122 meters above the river below. Engineers came from across Europe to study it. It was not just functional, it was beautiful, in that spare, purposeful way that only truly great engineering achieves. The arch of the viaduct had an elegance that owed nothing to classical ornament, nothing to historical precedent. It was beautiful because it was exactly and only what it needed to be. By 1884, Eiffel's firm had become one of the most sought-after structural engineering companies in the world. His team had worked on projects in South America, in Portugal, in Eastern Europe. They had built the internal iron skeleton of the Statue of Liberty, that gift from France to America that still stands in New York Harbor, designing the complex system of iron armature that allows Bartholdi's copper skin to flex in the wind without cracking. Eiffel understood better than almost anyone alive what iron could do, what iron could become. And so, when the competition for the World's Fair centerpiece was announced, Eiffel and his colleagues saw an opportunity. They had already been thinking about the problem. Two of his chief engineers, Maurice Koechlin and Émile Nouguier, had actually sketched a preliminary design for a very tall iron tower as early as 1884, almost as an intellectual exercise. They had shown the sketches to Eiffel, who had initially been underwhelmed, but the idea had stayed with him, growing and refining itself in his mind over the following months. When the World's Fair competition was announced in 1886, Eiffel sat down with his team and began to work in earnest. The competition brief was deceptively simple. The centerpiece of the fair should be a tower, 400 feet, roughly 120 meters, tall, capable of bearing its own weight and withstanding the wind. Over 100 teams submitted proposals. Many of them were elaborate and theatrical. Giant guillotines to commemorate the revolution, enormous stone columns, ornate metal structures draped in decorative ironwork. But Eiffel's proposal was something else entirely. Something that made the jury sit up straight and lean forward in their chairs. Not because it was decorated or theatrical, because it was almost insanely ambitious. Eiffel's proposal was not for a tower 400 feet tall, it was for a tower 300 meters tall. 300 meters, nearly 1,000 feet. More than twice the height specified in the competition brief, more than twice the height of anything that had ever been built by human hands in the entire history of civilization. The Washington Monument, completed just 2 years earlier in 1884, was the tallest structure in the world, and it stood 169 meters. Eiffel was proposing to build something nearly twice as tall. A tower that would not merely be the tallest structure in Paris or in France, but the tallest structure on the face of the entire Earth. The design was unlike anything the jury had ever seen. 4 massive curved legs, each one rising from a broad base and sweeping inward to meet at a central shaft. The legs were not straight vertical columns, but graceful parabolic curves, each one calculated to carry the tower's weight down to the ground with perfect efficiency, to spread the enormous load across 4 separate foundations. Between the legs and up the shaft, a complex lattice of iron, thousands of small metal bars crossing and recrossing each other in a pattern that was simultaneously delicate and immensely strong. There were to be 3 platforms, broad, accessible viewing decks at different heights, and at the very top, a small room for scientific instruments and weather observation. The whole thing would weigh approximately 7,300 tons of iron. It would be assembled from prefabricated components manufactured in Eiffel's factory in the Paris suburb of Levallois-Perret and brought to the site on horse-drawn carts. Every single rivet hole would be pre-drilled in the factory to within 1 millimeter of accuracy. The whole tower would essentially be a giant kit that would be assembled on-site, piece by piece, from the ground up. What made the design truly revolutionary, what set it apart from every other engineering proposal of its era, was the way it addressed the problem of wind. A structure this tall in the middle of a city exposed to the full force of Parisian weather would face enormous lateral forces. In a conventional building, these forces would be resisted by the weight and rigidity of the walls. But a tower like this had no walls, it was essentially an open metal framework, and the wind would howl right through it. How do you make something like that stable? Eiffel's answer was built into the very shape of the structure. The curves of the 4 legs were not just aesthetically pleasing, they were calculated to a precise mathematical formula. The curve of each leg was determined by the wind pressure that would act on the tower at every point along its height. The wider the base, the lower the center of gravity. The way the legs flared outward created a structure that was inherently stable against lateral forces. Not because it was rigid, but because it was shaped to absorb and distribute those forces throughout its entire frame. The tower was not fighting the wind, it was dancing with it. Eiffel presented his proposal with characteristic confidence. He had done the mathematics. He had run the calculations. He knew with the certainty that only a lifetime of structural engineering can give you that this tower could be built, that it would stand, that it would not fall over in a storm, would not collapse under its own weight, would not sink into the ground. He had calculated that the maximum sway of the top of the tower in the strongest winds would be less than 12 centimeters. 12 centimeters on a structure nearly 300 meters tall. The engineering margin of safety was enormous. But the jury was not composed entirely of engineers, and when they looked at the drawings, at this soaring skeletal tower of bare iron, utterly unlike anything in the classical tradition of architecture, utterly unlike any building that had ever stood in Paris, many of them felt something that had nothing to do with engineering calculations. They felt discomfort. They felt unease. They felt the particular vertigo that comes from encountering something that is genuinely new, genuinely unprecedented, genuinely unlike anything you have ever imagined before. A metal tower in the heart of Paris, the city of Versailles and Notre Dame and the Louvre, and now this. The jury awarded Eiffel the commission anyway. The engineering was simply too brilliant to reject, and the boldness of the proposal was exactly what France needed, a statement that was not just modern but radical, not just impressive, but genuinely unprecedented. Eiffel was given his commission. He would build his tower in time for the World's Fair opening in May 1889. The timeline was brutal, roughly 2 years for something that had never been done before. But Eiffel had negotiated favorable terms. He would personally finance much of the construction in exchange for the right to operate the tower commercially for 20 years. After that, it would revert to the city of Paris, which could demolish it if it wished. The permit was signed, the funding was arranged, the engineering drawings were finalized, and almost immediately, all hell broke loose. The protest that erupted against the Eiffel Tower in the months before construction began was not a quiet murmur of architectural disapproval. It was a full-throated, passionate, furious howl of outrage from some of the most brilliant and influential people in France. Writers and painters and sculptors and architects, the cultural elite of Paris, the guardians of French civilization, looked at the plans for this iron tower and felt, with an intensity that seems almost incomprehensible in retrospect, that something sacred was being violated, that the soul of Paris was under attack. The most famous expression of this fury was a document that has gone down in history under various names, the Protest of the 300, or the Artist Pursuit's Protest, or simply the Manifesto Against the Tower. It appeared in the newspaper Le Temps on February 14, 1887, just days before construction was due to begin. It was signed by 300 of France's most prominent cultural figures, among them the novelist Guy de Maupassant, the composer Charles Gounod, the architect Charles Garnier, who had designed the Paris Opera, the poet François Coppée, and many, many others. 300 names, 300 voices, 300 people who looked at Eiffel's tower and saw a catastrophe. The language they used was extraordinary, not measured or diplomatic or politely concerned, but passionate, visceral, almost desperate. They described the tower as a gigantic black smokestack. They called it a blot on the cityscape. They said it would crush under its barbarous mass the Cathedral of Notre Dame, the Sainte-Chapelle, the Louvre, the Arc de Triomphe. They worried that tourists and travelers would look at Paris from a distance and see, above everything else, this ugly iron chimney, and that the city's reputation for beauty would be permanently, irreparably damaged. "We come," they wrote, "in the name of French taste and the endangered art and history of France, to protest with all our force, with all our indignation, in the name of the belittled French taste, against this erection in the heart of our capital, of the useless and monstrous Eiffel Tower, which public spitefulness has already baptized the Tower of Babel." The Tower of Babel, that ancient symbol of human arrogance overreaching itself. That was how these 300 brilliant men and women saw Eiffel's masterpiece. The newspapers were merciless. Cartoonists mocked the design with gleeful cruelty, imagining all the ways it might collapse, all the ways it might look ridiculous, all the ways it degraded the beauty of the city around it. One newspaper columnist wrote that Parisians would have to live with the shadow of this odious column of bolted sheet metal falling across their neighborhoods for years to come. Another wrote that the tower was the work of someone who has never built anything but railway stations and bridges, intending this as an insult, though history would judge it rather differently. The objections were not merely aesthetic. Some were practical and technical. Engineers, or at least people who called themselves engineers, wrote to newspapers claiming that Eiffel's calculations were wrong, that the tower would collapse under its own weight, that the foundations would give way under the enormous downward pressure of 7,300 tons of iron. One critic estimated, with impressive-sounding precision, that the tower would begin to buckle when it reached a height of 228 meters. Others worried about lightning, that a structure this tall, made entirely of metal, would attract lightning bolts with devastating frequency, setting fires and electrocuting anyone foolish enough to be near it. There was a particular cruelty in the fact that the tower would be built in the Champ de Mars, the great open park that stretched from the military academy down to the Seine. This was one of the most beloved open spaces in Paris, a place of Sunday afternoon strolls, of military parades, of ordinary Parisian life. To plant this enormous iron structure in the middle of it felt, to many Parisians, like a kind of desecration, like putting a factory in the middle of a cathedral. Eiffel himself was remarkably unruffled by the storm. He gave interviews, he published responses, he explained, patiently and without apparent irritation, that the tower was not an eyesore, but a work of engineering beauty, that the curves of its legs were not arbitrary but mathematically precise, that the lattice of its ironwork was not crude industrialism, but the purest expression of structural logic. "I believe that the tower will have its own beauty," he said in one famous response. "The first principles of architectural beauty are that the essential lines of a construction be determined by a perfect appropriateness to its use." He was not arguing for taste. He was arguing for something deeper, for truth. Guy de Maupassant, one of the most vocal critics, was said to have eaten lunch in the tower's ground-floor restaurant every day after it opened. Not, he claimed, because he had changed his mind about the tower, but because it was the only place in Paris from which you could not see the tower. It is a story that may be apocryphal, but it has survived because it captures something true about the paradox of the tower's reception. Even those who hated it were unable to ignore it. All while the protests continued, all while the newspapers mocked and the 300 signatories shook their heads, all while Parisians walked past the construction site and craned their necks to see this strange iron skeleton growing, day by day, above the rooftops of their city. The public reaction on the ground was complex and fascinating. Not everyone hated the tower. Plenty of ordinary Parisians were curious, excited, proud. They argued about it in cafes and over dinner tables. They brought their children to watch the construction. They argued with their neighbors about whether it was beautiful or ugly, magnificent or monstrous, the future of architecture or its worst nightmare. Eiffel himself visited the site every day. He had a small apartment at the very top of the tower, which he had built for himself as a private workspace and retreat, a room with a few pieces of simple furniture and a view of the entire city. He entertained scientists and writers there during the fair, and it is said that Thomas Edison visited him in that little room. Eiffel spent hours every week on the construction site, talking to his engineers and his foremen, checking the work, solving problems as they arose. He was not just the designer of the tower, he was its chief champion, its most passionate advocate, its one-man publicity department. Every interview he gave, every public statement he made, was a quiet act of defiance against the people who wanted to see his tower fail. There is a kind of magic to watching a great structure rise. It happens slowly at first, so slowly that you can almost convince yourself it is not happening at all. And then one day you look up and something has changed. Something has crossed a threshold. Something that was once just a construction site, just a collection of raw materials and cranes and workers, has become unmistakably, undeniably, irrevocably a thing. This is what happened in Paris between 1887 and 1889. The tower rose slowly at first, while the foundations were being laid and the first legs were going up. By the end of 1887, the 4 legs were in place, connected by the first floor platform at a height of about 57 meters. People who had been watching the construction with skepticism began to feel, despite themselves, a grudging sense of wonder. The legs were enormous, Each one was a complex, beautifully crafted lattice of iron bars, the curves of their lower sections already hinting at the graceful arch that would define the completed structure. Through 1888, the tower grew more rapidly. The second platform at 115 meters was completed by the middle of the year, and then the central shaft began to climb toward its final height. By the end of 1888, the tower was over 200 meters tall, already the tallest structure in the world, already visible from every neighborhood in Paris, already a presence that could not be ignored. People who had been dismissing it from a distance as an abstract concept now had to confront it as a physical reality. It was there. It was enormous. It was unlike anything they had ever seen. The moment when the tower surpassed the Washington Monument, taking the title of the world's tallest man-made structure, went largely unremarked at the time. There were no formal ceremonies, no official announcements. But in the newspapers and the cafes, people were beginning to talk differently about the tower. Not all of them, and not all at once. But something had shifted. The same structure that had been a drawing, a plan, a target for mockery, was becoming a reality. And reality has a way of changing perspectives. Think about what the citizens of Paris were experiencing. For months, this tower had been invisible, something you could choose to ignore if you walked past the construction site quickly enough, something that existed only in blueprints and newspaper articles and cafe arguments. And then, almost overnight, it became impossible to ignore. You could see it from the Montmartre Hill to the north. You could see it from the Bois de Boulogne to the west. You could see it from the streets of the Marais, from the quays of the Seine, from the windows of apartments all across the city. Every time you stepped outside, there it was. For those who had signed the protest, this was exactly the nightmare they had predicted. There was the tower, dominating the skyline, casting its shadow across the Champ de Mars. There was the iron chimney, rising above Notre Dame and the Louvre and the Sacré-Cœur. There was the thing they had tried to prevent, now standing 300 meters tall, now officially the tallest structure in the history of the world, utterly indifferent to their objections. But for many ordinary Parisians, and for the thousands of workers who had spent 2 years building it, the tower's completion was a source of enormous pride. This was their city's contribution to the world. This was the thing that Paris had done that no one else had done, that no one else had even dreamed of doing. The great cathedrals and palaces and boulevards of Paris had been built over centuries. This tower had been built in 26 months. That was what modern engineering could do. That was what France could do. On March 31st, 1889, Gustave Eiffel climbed all 1,710 steps to the top of his tower, the elevators were not yet functioning, and planted the French tricolor at its peak. He was 56 years old. He had spent the better part of a decade imagining this moment. He stood at the top of the world's tallest structure, in the city that had tried to stop him from building it, and looked out across Paris in every direction. The city spread beneath him like a map, the Seine winding through it, the great landmarks reduced to toys, the rooftops of 3 million lives laid out like a tapestry. It must have been one of the greatest moments of his life. The Exposition Universelle of 1889 opened on May 6th, and from the very first day, the Eiffel Tower was the undisputed star of the show. The fair attracted nearly 32 million visitors over its 6-month run, an almost incomprehensible number for the era, drawn from every corner of France, every country in Europe, and far beyond. They came for the exhibits, for the demonstrations of new technology, for the spectacle of the modern world displaying its achievements. But above all else, they came for the tower. The queues to ascend the tower stretched for hundreds of meters from the moment the fair opened. People waited for hours. They came back multiple times. They sent letters home to their families describing what it felt like to stand at the top, to look out across Paris from 300 meters up, to experience a perspective that no ordinary person had ever experienced before. For most visitors, this was the first time they had ever been truly high up, higher than a church tower, higher than a hill, high enough that the city below looked like a model, like something from a dream. The elevators were a sensation in themselves. The tower had 4 elevator systems, one in each of the 4 legs for the journey to the first and second platforms, and a central elevator for the final ascent to the top. These were hydraulic elevators, powered by water pressure, and their design had presented enormous engineering challenges because the legs of the tower were curved, not vertical. The American elevator company Otis, the same company whose founder had famously demonstrated his safety elevator by cutting the cable and surviving, built 2 of the 4 elevator systems. The technology was cutting edge, and it worked. Visitors stepped into an elevator cage at the base of the tower and emerged a few minutes later in the sky. Nearly 2 million people ascended the tower during the 6 months of the fair. 2 million people who had, in many cases, arrived expecting to be unimpressed, or at least ambivalent, who had read the newspapers, heard the protests, absorbed the cultural consensus that this tower was ugly and wrong and alien to the spirit of Paris. And many of them, not all, but many, came down from the tower as converts. Not necessarily to the tower's aesthetics, not necessarily to Eiffel's vision of an iron future for architecture, but to the simple, undeniable physical reality of the experience. Because there is something that happens to you at the top of the Eiffel Tower that no amount of advanced knowledge can quite prepare you for. You can know the statistics: 300 meters, 1,710 steps, visibility for 70 kilometers on a clear day, and still be surprised by the actual sensation. The city falling away below you, the horizon expanding in every direction, the silence or near silence up there above the traffic and the crowds. The sense of perspective, literal and metaphorical, that comes from seeing the city you thought you knew from a point of view that is entirely and irreducibly new. The tower generated enormous revenue during the fair. Ticket sales far exceeded Eiffel's projections. The restaurants in the first-floor platform, which included a French restaurant, a British restaurant, a Flemish restaurant, a Russian restaurant, and a bar, were packed every day. Eiffel had invested approximately 7.8 million francs of his own money in the construction, and by the end of the fair, he had recouped the entire investment. The tower was not just a cultural statement, it was a commercial triumph. And yet, the controversy had not entirely died. There were still those who refused to be impressed, still writers and critics who maintained, in the teeth of the evidence, that the tower was a monstrosity, that its commercial success proved nothing about its aesthetic worth. But the voice of the opposition was noticeably quieter than it had been 2 years before. Something had changed in the relationship between Paris and its strange iron guest. The city was beginning, tentatively and perhaps grudgingly, to accept that the tower was not going away. At least not yet. But here is the thing that most people do not know. The thing that turns the story of the Eiffel Tower from a simple tale of triumph over adversity into something far more interesting and more precarious. When Gustave Eiffel signed his agreement with the city of Paris, he agreed to the following terms. The tower would stand for 20 years. At the end of that period, in the year 1909, the city would have the right to demolish it, and not just the right, the stated intention, the plan. The tower had been conceived as a temporary structure. Its purpose was to serve as the centerpiece of the 1889 World's Fair, to demonstrate what French engineering could achieve, to give the fair a landmark that would draw visitors and generate headlines around the world. Once the fair was over, the logic went, there was no reason for it to remain. It was too tall and too dominant and too industrial to fit into the aesthetic fabric of Paris permanently. It would be taken apart, its iron melted down and sold, and the Champ de Mars would be returned to its previous state. This was not a fringe view. This was the official plan. The demolition permit was embedded in the original agreement. And for the first several years after the fair, the demolition of the tower in 1909 was widely accepted as the most likely outcome. The initial excitement had faded. The fair was over. The tower was no longer new. It was just there. A very tall iron structure in the Champ de Mars, requiring constant maintenance, generating some tourist revenue, but not obviously serving any critical public function. Many Parisians, including some who had come to accept its presence, quietly assumed that it would be gone within a decade. Through the 1890s, the tower continued to operate. Eiffel used his agreement's provision that the tower would remain under his management for 20 years to keep it running as a tourist attraction and to use it for scientific experiments. He was deeply interested in aerodynamics, and the tower was a perfect platform for dropping objects and measuring how they fell through the air. He conducted meteorological experiments, measuring temperature and pressure at different heights. He built a small laboratory in the upper parts of the structure. The tower, which had been built as a monument, was becoming a research tool. But none of this was enough to guarantee its survival. The 20-year clock was ticking. 1909 was approaching. And the question of what to do with the tower, whether to demolish it as planned or to find some reason to keep it, was becoming increasingly urgent. The cultural opposition had never entirely disappeared. There were still Parisians who looked at the tower and saw an ugly intrusion, who would be relieved to see it gone, who looked forward to the restoration of the pre-tower skyline. The tower itself seemed to understand its precarious position, if a structure can be said to understand anything. It continued to attract visitors, but in declining numbers as the novelty wore off. It was still the tallest structure in the world. It would hold that record until 1930, when the Chrysler Building in New York took the title. But the world was changing around it. New materials and new techniques were making tall structures increasingly common. The era of the skyscraper was approaching. The sheer fact of being very tall was becoming less remarkable. And so the tower entered the first decade of the 20th century with its fate genuinely uncertain. It had survived the protests and the mockery of the 1880s. It had survived the end of the fair and the beginning of the period of indifference that followed. It had become a part of the Paris landscape in the way that any sufficiently large and permanent-seeming object becomes part of a landscape, simply by being there day after day, year after year, becoming familiar, becoming normal, becoming almost unremarkable. But familiarity is not the same as love, and normal is not the same as necessary. The demolition permit still existed, the clock was still running, and in 1909, Paris would have to make a choice. The thing that saved the Eiffel Tower was not beauty. It was not sentiment. It was not the protests of tourists or the arguments of aesthetes or the slow, gradual shift in public taste that was beginning to find something impressive in the tower's spare, logical elegance. What saved the Eiffel Tower was radio. Or, more precisely, what saved it was the recognition by the French military that this very tall metal structure standing in the middle of Paris was the single best radio antenna in the country. The story of wireless telegraphy in France in the first decade of the 20th century is inextricably linked to the story of the Eiffel Tower. Radio, the transmission of information through electromagnetic waves without wires, had been demonstrated by Guglielmo Marconi in 1895. Within a decade, it was clear that this technology was going to transform everything. Communication, commerce, navigation, warfare. Nations that could communicate instantly across vast distances would have enormous advantages over those that could not. And the key variable in early radio communication was antenna height. The higher the antenna, the farther the signal could travel. Gustave Eiffel, who was deeply interested in practical applications of his tower beyond simple tourism, began experimenting with radio transmissions from the top of the structure as early as 1898. He worked with the French physicist Eugène Ducretet, who successfully transmitted and received radio signals from the Eiffel Tower to the Pantheon, a distance of about 4 kilometers, in 1898. This was one of the earliest demonstrations of urban radio communication in the world. But the military implications were not fully grasped until the early 1900s, when it became clear that the Eiffel Tower could transmit signals not just across Paris, but across the English Channel, across France, and potentially across much larger distances. In 1903, the French army established a permanent military radio station at the base of the tower. In 1906, a radio engineer named Captain Gustave Ferrier, one of the pioneers of French military communications, installed more powerful transmitting equipment and began using the tower as the hub of a rapidly expanding French military radio network. The timing was critical. Europe in the first decade of the 20th century was a continent ratcheting toward catastrophe. The major powers were building up their armies and their navies, forming alliances and counter-alliances, testing each other's boundaries and ambitions. War, the war that would eventually become the First World War, was not yet inevitable, but it was thinkable. And in a war, the ability to communicate quickly and securely across long distances was not just convenient. It was potentially the difference between victory and defeat. French military planners looked at the Eiffel Tower and saw something that no one had imagined when Eiffel designed it in the 1880s. They saw a communications asset, a strategic asset, a piece of national infrastructure that could play a real role in defending France against its enemies. Demolishing it would mean giving up the most powerful radio transmitter in France at precisely the moment when radio was becoming the most important communications technology in the world. This was not an aesthetic question or a cultural question or a question of Parisian pride. This was a question of national security. The case for keeping the tower was made, and it was made convincingly. In 1909, when the demolition permit came due, the city of Paris quietly allowed it to lapse. The tower would not be demolished. It would be transferred to the city's permanent ownership. The 20-year experiment had become a permanent fixture. The temporary had become eternal. Gustave Eiffel, who had watched his tower survive the protests and the mockery and the years of indifference and the approaching threat of demolition, lived to see it saved. He died in 1923, aged 91, having seen his tower become not just a landmark, but a legend. He is buried in the Levallois-Perret cemetery, not far from the factory where his tower was made. The tower's radio importance was demonstrated dramatically during the First World War, which began in 1914. The tower's radio station intercepted German military communications, including a famous interception in 1914 that helped reveal the movements of the German army during the Battle of the Marne, a critical engagement in the early weeks of the war that stopped the German advance and prevented the rapid defeat of France. Whether or not the tower's role in that battle was decisive, the symbolic power of the story was immense. The tower that Paris had tried to tear down had helped save Paris from the Germans. The transformation of the Eiffel Tower's reputation from derided monstrosity to beloved symbol did not happen overnight. It was a process that unfolded over decades through a complex and fascinating interplay of changing artistic tastes, shifting cultural politics, and the simple, irresistible power of familiarity. But it did happen. Completely. Irreversibly. So completely that today it requires a genuine effort of historical imagination to remember that this tower was ever anything other than magnificent. The first group to change their minds, perhaps surprisingly, was the artistic avant-garde, the very group that had been, in many ways, the most vociferous in its opposition. The writers and painters and sculptors of the generation that followed the 300 signatories of the protest looked at the Eiffel Tower and saw something entirely different from what their predecessors had seen. They did not see an ugly industrial chimney imposed on the classical beauty of Paris. They saw the future. They saw a structure that embodied the radical newness of the modern world, the world of machines, of speed, of electricity, of a reality that was fundamentally different from anything that had existed before. The painter Robert Delaunay was perhaps the most important figure in this artistic rehabilitation. Beginning around 1909, Delaunay painted the Eiffel Tower more than 30 times, fragmenting it, multiplying it, embedding it in swirls of color and light, using it as the central symbol of his Orpheus style of abstract painting. For Delaunay, the tower was not industrial ugliness, but industrial poetry, a new kind of beauty that required a new kind of art to capture it. His paintings of the tower are among the most vibrant and exciting works of early 20th century European art, and they did as much as anything to change the cultural story of the structure. The poets followed. Guillaume Apollinaire, the great modernist poet who was a close friend of Delaunay's, wrote about the tower with genuine affection, seeing in it a symbol of the new century's audacity and imagination. Marc Chagall painted it. Fernand Léger celebrated it. The artistic mainstream of the early 20th century, the avant-garde that would become the mainstream, embraced the tower as their own, as a symbol of everything they were trying to do in their art, to break with the past, to find new forms for new realities, to embrace the modern world rather than retreating from it. At the same time, the tower was being claimed by popular culture with an enthusiasm that no deliberate campaign could have manufactured. The postcard industry, which exploded in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, turned the Eiffel Tower into one of its most popular subjects almost from the moment the tower opened. Millions of postcards featuring the tower were sold every year, sent from Paris to every corner of the world, carrying the tower's image into homes and hands and imaginations on every continent. Before cinema, before television, before the internet, the postcard was one of the primary ways that people learned what the world looked like. and the Eiffel Tower became one of the world's most recognizable images through this modest medium. Cinema claimed the tower early. In the first decades of the film era, the tower appeared in movies as a symbol of Paris, and by extension, of Europe, of modernity, of romance. Films set in Paris almost inevitably included a shot of the tower because the tower had become, with astonishing speed, the shorthand for Paris itself. You showed the tower, and audiences knew immediately where they were. No other building anywhere in the world had achieved this level of instant symbolic recognition. Not the pyramids, not the Colosseum, not Big Ben. The Eiffel Tower had become the universal symbol of a city, and through that city, of an entire civilization. Tourism played its part. The numbers of visitors to the tower grew steadily through the early decades of the 20th century, dipped during the First World War, when the tower was primarily a military asset rather than a tourist attraction, recovered in the 1920s, dipped again during the Second World War, and then exploded in the decades after 1945 as international travel became accessible to millions of people who had never traveled before. By the 1960s, the tower was receiving millions of visitors a year. By the end of the 20th century, it was receiving more than 6 million. Today, the figure is approaching 8 million. There is also the matter of the light. In 1889, the tower had been equipped with gas lamps, replaced by electric floodlights in the early 20th century, but the tower's transformation into a nighttime spectacle, something that many consider even more beautiful than the daytime tower, came gradually through successive innovations in lighting technology. Today, the tower is illuminated by golden lights every night, and on the hour from dusk to 1 a.m., it sparkles with 20,000 flickering light bulbs in a display that has been declared the most photographed event in the world. This glittering version of the tower, this nocturnal vision of golden light against the Paris sky, was unimaginable to the engineers and critics of 1887. It belongs entirely to the future they could not see. There is a thought experiment that sometimes does the rounds among people who think about cities and architecture and the nature of symbols. Imagine Paris without the Eiffel Tower. Imagine the skyline without that distinctive silhouette. Imagine the Champ de Mars as a flat, open park with nothing rising above its trees. Imagine the postcards, the films, the logos, the mental images, all stripped of the one element that, more than any other, signals Paris to the global imagination. What is left? Paris without the Eiffel Tower is still Paris, of course. It still has Notre Dame and the Louvre and the Seine and the boulevards and the cafes and centuries of cultural achievement. It still has the beauty that the 300 protesters were trying to preserve in 1887. But it is a different Paris, a less recognizable Paris, a Paris that would be harder to picture for the billions of people who have never been there, who know the city only through its representations in art and film and media. The tower has become inseparable from our idea of the city. It has become, in a very real sense, more Parisian than Paris. This is one of the strangest and most instructive ironies in the history of architecture. The structure that was supposed to violate the spirit of Paris, to impose an alien, industrial aesthetic on a city of classical beauty, has become the ultimate expression of that city's identity. The thing that was supposed to ruin Paris's image around the world has become the most powerful image of Paris the world has ever known. The mistake has become the masterpiece. The numbers, at this point, are almost meaningless in their enormity. More than 300 million people have visited the Eiffel Tower since it opened in 1889, making it the most visited paid monument in the world. Every year, visitors from more than 180 countries climb its stairs or ride its elevators. The tower appears in approximately 1 billion Instagram posts, making it the most photographed monument in the history of social media. A model of the tower appears on the shelves of souvenir shops in cities from Tokyo to Buenos Aires, from Cairo to Toronto. It has been reproduced in every material imaginable: iron, plastic, wood, chocolate, crystal. At every scale from microscopic to near full size. There is a full-size replica in Las Vegas, a half-size replica in China, and hundreds of smaller replicas scattered across the world. The tower is maintained with extraordinary care by the Société d'Exploitation de la Tour Eiffel, the company that has managed it on behalf of the city of Paris since 1980. Every 7 years, the tower is repainted, a process that requires 60 tons of paint and 25 painters working for 18 months. The paint is mixed to a specific shade called Eiffel Tower Brown, which is actually applied in 3 slightly different tones, darker at the bottom, lighter at the top, to make the tower appear uniform in color despite the effect of atmospheric perspective. Every bolt is inspected, every weld examined, every structural element tested. The tower that its critics predicted would be crumbling within a decade has been maintained so meticulously that its structural integrity is essentially as good as it was in 1889. Gustave Eiffel, who died in 1923, did not live to see the full scope of what he had created. He saw the tower saved from demolition. He saw it become famous. He saw it defended by armies of admirers as passionate as the armies of detractors who had opposed it in 1887. He saw his name become synonymous with his tower, the Eiffel Tower, Eiffel's Tower, as if the name of the man and the name of the structure had merged into something indivisible. But he could not have foreseen the scale of what would follow. The hundreds of millions of visitors, the billions of photographs, the replicas in every city on Earth, the transformation of a temporary iron structure into perhaps the most universally recognized human-made object in the history of the world. The story of the Eiffel Tower is, at its heart, a story about the gap between the judgment of contemporaries and the judgment of history. The 300 who signed the protest in 1887 were not stupid people or Philistines or enemies of progress. They were some of the most intelligent, most cultured, most genuinely perceptive people in France. They looked at Eiffel's Tower and they judged it as honestly as they could, applying the aesthetic standards and the cultural values that they had spent their lives developing and defending. And they got it completely catastrophically wrong. This is sobering. It should make us humble about our own aesthetic judgments, our own confident pronouncements about what is beautiful and what is ugly, what belongs in our cities and what violates them. Because the history of architecture is full of buildings that were hated when they were built and are now beloved, and full of others that were celebrated when they were built and are now considered disasters. The gap between contemporary opinion and lasting value is almost impossible to predict in advance. What Eiffel understood, and what his critics did not, was that the tower was beautiful not in spite of its engineering logic, but because of it. The curves of its legs, the lattice of its ironwork, the way its mass decreased as it rose toward its delicate crown, these were not the products of artistic inspiration or decorative intent, but of mathematical necessity. They were the shapes that physics and material science required, and because they were true, because they were the exact and inevitable shapes that the forces at play demanded, they were beautiful in the deepest and most durable sense. This is what Eiffel meant when he said that the first principles of architectural beauty are that the essential lines of a construction be determined by a perfect appropriateness to its use. He was not arguing against beauty. He was arguing for a different kind of beauty, one that emerged from function rather than being applied over it, one that was inherent in the structure rather than added to it. He was arguing for an aesthetic philosophy that would, in the following century, become the dominant philosophy of modern architecture. He was, in this sense, not just an engineer who built a famous tower. He was a thinker who helped define the visual language of modernity. Stand at the base of the Eiffel Tower on any morning and watch the tourists arrive. They come from everywhere, from China and Brazil and Japan and Nigeria and Australia and America and 100 other countries. They come in families and in pairs and in school groups and alone. They come speaking every language on earth. And when they look up at the tower above them, when they crane their necks back and follow those 4 great curved legs upward into the sky, they all have the same expression on their faces. It is not a complicated expression. It is the expression of someone who is genuinely, unambiguously, undeniably impressed. Not all of them can tell you why they are impressed. Not all of them have heard about the 300 protesters, or the demolition permit, or the radio transmissions that saved the tower's life. Not all of them know Gustave Eiffel's name, or the story of the construction, or the details of the mathematical genius embedded in every curve of every leg. They simply look up and they feel something, something that is partly wonder and partly awe, and partly the particular human pleasure of being in the presence of something that is genuinely, unmistakably, purely great. That feeling, That instinctive, wordless recognition of greatness is what the 300 could not feel in 1887. Not because they were less intelligent or less sensitive than we are, but because they were standing too close to it in time, too embedded in the assumptions and the prejudices and the aesthetic frameworks of their particular moment to see it clearly. They could not see what would happen next. They could not see the decades of art and film and postcards and tourists and changing tastes that would transform their city's most hated structure into its most beloved. They could not see history. We have the luxury of seeing it now. We know how the story ends, or rather we know that it has not ended, that the story is still being written, that every day 8 million more people add their chapter to the story of this tower by visiting it, photographing it, falling in love with it in their own way. We know that Eiffel was right and the 300 were wrong. We know that the tower was worth building, worth saving, worth maintaining for over a century and counting. But perhaps the most important thing we know, the thing that makes this story more than just a feel-good narrative about a famous landmark, is what it tells us about the nature of greatness. Greatness is almost never recognized in its own time. The things that endure, the paintings and buildings and books and ideas that last not just for a generation but for centuries, are very often the things that seem strange or wrong or out of place to the people who first encounter them. The things that fit perfectly into their moment tend to die with that moment. The things that seem to belong to no particular moment tend to belong to all of them. The Eiffel Tower was supposed to be temporary. It was supposed to stand for 20 years and then be dismantled, its iron melted down, its memory fading like the memory of a fair. Instead, it has outlasted every one of the 300 people who signed the petition against it, outlasted the political systems and the cultural fashions and the aesthetic orthodoxies of the world they lived in, outlasted every skyscraper that has risen to eclipse its height, outlasted 2 world wars and a dozen French governments and a century of history that has changed almost everything that seemed permanent in 1887. Gustave Eiffel once said, reflecting on the attacks on his tower, "I ought to be jealous of the tower. She is more famous than I am." He said it with a smile. He did not mind. He had built something that was bigger than him, something that would carry his name into a future he could not imagine. He had built, as it turned out, the most famous structure in the history of the world. The Eiffel Tower was never meant to last. It was permitted, planned, and in many ways expected to disappear. But permanence, it seems, has a way of choosing its own objects, of settling into the things that deserve it, regardless of what their creators intended or their critics predicted. Paris tried to reject this tower. Paris tried to prevent it, to limit it, to erase it. And instead it became Paris. Not just a part of Paris, not just a landmark in Paris, but the thing the world thinks of when it thinks of Paris. The symbol, the icon, the soul of the city made visible in iron. What was once called a mistake became the face of an entire civilization. What was once condemned as temporary became eternal. The Eiffel Tower was never meant to last, but today Paris cannot exist without it.